Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's webinar with Dr. Ray Middleton. We're going to be talking about some trauma-informed tips for how we can take approaches to tackling COVID-19 in the homeless sector. For those of you who it's your first time using GoToWebinar or joining one of our Fianza webinar series, you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen a little box with some drop-down arrows. And there is a questions section. If at any point during the webinar you have some thoughts or questions, you want some more information, you can throw your questions into that box and I'll be monitoring it so I can feed it into Ray either during the webinar or at the end. We'll have plenty of time for some conversations if you have any questions. As a quick reminder, this is part of a weekly webinar series that we have been running since the start of COVID-19 and the lockdowns and shutdowns across Europe. We have so you can watch back all the webinars we've done to date on our website. We'll share that information at the end of the session. As a reminder, this session is recorded, so you'll get a recording of this webinar. Ray has a series of resources that I'll come back to in a moment, and we'll be sharing those via email at the end, and you can also access the PowerPoint as well. Next week, we'll have a webinar from Sharon Kerr from the Rock Trust, which will be dealing with frontline workers and having a sense of being overwhelmed and how do you manage that. And the week after that, in the same time slot, we'll have another webinar that will be looking at domestic violence in homeless services during COVID-19. So looking at some guidelines for dealing with those questions. Yes, I have some questions put in about, is this for you ask your questions? It is, Ray. So with that said, I want to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Ray Middleton. He is a workforce development lead at Fulfilling Lives in the northeast of England, and he's also an independent online trainer. He has just finished a chapter in a new book called Cross-Cultural Dialogues on Homelessness, which has been edited by Jay Levy and Robin Johnson. Two, I guess, leading experts in the field of homelessness. One, Jay, was more responsible on the pre-treatment approach for homeless services in the US, and Robin Johnson, many of you may know him through his development of psychologically informed environments. In this webinar, Ray is going to be sharing some tips on trauma-informed approaches to COVID-19. He might reference some blogs and some videos, which are useful resources, and they will be sent out after the webinar as part of the additional resources. So with all that said, I'm going to hand over to Ray now, and Ray, you can take it away.
Thanks, Robbie. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, and we can see your presentation, and we can also see you.
That's great. Thanks, Robbie. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts here about a trauma-informed approach to this pandemic. So thanks for the invitation. I was just struggling a bit there because I've got two basset hounds. We're all adjusting to working from home, and one of them was just trying to join in the presentation. So this is the challenges we've all got of adjusting to the changed world of the coronavirus. So what I'm going to do is just share some tips drawn from the world of trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approaches. And I'm going to try to keep that fairly succinct, because what I'm really interested in is people's response as well to that, because these ideas and concepts, I believe, can be really helpful and useful. But what's important, I like an open dialogue approach to the work, where we try to then, as you listen, you'll think about your own local context, and some things will connect, and you'll think, how would I apply that to my local context or a service I'm involved with, or someone I'm aware of, in terms of trying to deliver homeless services in a changed world. And so I'm going to be succinct about the tips and try to illustrate them with how they might apply in England at the moment and how we're trying to respond to the homeless situation in terms of the virus. But then I'd be keen to hear people's questions or comments or observations as you think about these tips, to think, well, would that help? Because a trauma-informed approach is a bit like a pair of glasses or a lens. It's a trauma-informed lens to look at the work through. And I think some of the concepts could help us at this time. So, just bear with me. Get to the first tip. The first tip is to see the pandemic and our reactions to it through a trauma-informed lens. where we consider both the traumatic event and our varying reactions to that event. So it's not a trauma, isn't just a trauma. In trauma-informed approaches, it's a combination of the trauma and our reaction to it. It could be some thoughts, it could be some emotion, like anger or fear that we might have as staff or the people we're supporting without a home or around accommodation support and other services are having emotional reactions and thoughts as well as our behavior. So it's the trauma and the reaction to it. And pandemics disproportionately affect the poor and those with less power in society. So although in the media there have been comments about it doesn't discriminate, the data and the science shows it does. So poorer people have less access to healthcare. So we know that from homeless work, working with people without a home even before the pandemic, is they have less access for lots of different systemic reasons to healthcare, for example, and people tend to die about 20 years younger than other people. So we know that they'll be exaggerated, those inequalities in public health through this pandemic. So we need to acknowledge that, and that it is a threat to our physical and psychological safety. And so seeing it in a trauma-informed way is helpful because you're articulating something. And the ACEs studies are adverse childhood experiences, which many people will be familiar with, but if you're not, you can Google them. The ACEs studies have shown us that people who are without a home, people who are homeless, but also people who use alcohol and drug services, people using mental health services, have disproportionately high levels of unresolved trauma in their past compared to people who are not using those services. So it's a way to get out of this siloed way of thinking that this is mental health and this is addiction services or substance misuse services, by looking at the science and the data there. So for example, people with 6 or more adverse childhood events or experiences compared to people with none tend to die on average 20 years younger than people with no adverse childhood experiences. And so that just helps to see that disproportionately the trauma of the pandemic will affect people who are homeless disproportionately because they have higher levels of unresolved trauma. So it will trigger a lot of issues for them, and some of the injustice about access to healthcare, for example, will be exaggerated potentially through the pandemic. So my next tip then is to consider that there's diversity and difference in people's reactions to a traumatic threat, which likely connects to the extent to which people's past experiences of trauma is being triggered by current adversity. And so I'd mentioned the ACEs studies already. So that can help when we're a bit confused about different people having different reactions, either our colleagues, maybe, if we're working in a staff team or we're working with people without a home. We might be thinking, well, why are people reacting differently? Why is my colleague very stressed? Why am I a bit calmer? Or vice versa? Why are they seem to be dealing with it better? It's because we're all different. And we all have a different history and we all have different traumas in our past, which may be resolved or not. And when working with people, trying to maybe bring them in from rough sleeping into some emergency accommodation, it might be in your country that hotels have been taken over in order to house people, to help them to social distance, or there might be other solutions to the public health crisis. But we might be thinking, it's strange that different people that we're serving and supporting are reacting differently. But it helps to see that there's this diversity and difference, because some things might be triggering us. Other people might think that the social distancing is suiting them because there's less need to deal and interact with other human beings, which is they find quite stressful. So that's worth bearing in mind. And those reactions that people have. So although you can react well to a trauma, and most people cope well with traumatic events, we can have health harming reactions as well. So it might be that if I feel very stressed for a long period of time, I start drinking alcohol to excess to try and manage that uncomfortable emotion. And that becomes a health harming habit. Or for other people, it might be that they self-harm to cope with stress. And so in a stressful situation because of the pandemic, on top of what other problems people were dealing with at the time, it's a time of adversity. And so those health-harming habits, which are trying to control uncomfortable emotions, like drinking too much, taking drugs, self-harming. Other health-harming habits might increase, then that would make sense through a trauma-informed lens. So that's one of the ways in that diversity and difference of reactions to trauma. So that brings us on to the third point. The third tip is the process of making sense of trauma in a healthy way. Remember, most people will process trauma in a healthy way and it won't go on to have lasting effects. But there's a name for that. And where it leaves no lasting negative effects is called resilience in England. Or that's the word we've used in English. There'll be other words around Europe for that phrase. But that's what it means. It's the process of making sense of trauma in a healthy way. And it's worth thinking about that concept from trauma-informed care as we try and make sense of the work that we're doing. And particularly, it helps to think about resilience in a social way, because some traditional ways of talking about resilience thinks it's just inside someone, like a trait. But actually, it's much more helpful, I believe, to think about social resilience, because that's connected to the quality of relationships within someone's social network. So improving someone's relationships within their positive social network increases their resilience to cope with life's adversities. So remember, we are part of someone's social network of resilience when we connect with them. So what's helpful to think about there is that people without a home, in various levels and degrees of homelessness that we're aware of, they might have just got into supported accommodation, or they might be in one of these temporary taken over hotels, but they will tend to have quite a poor social network around them usually. So we're really important. And what I want us to think about then is if resilience and making sense of and coping with this pandemic and the potential trauma of it is connected to our network, it's really important that we, as maybe staff working in homeless services, connect to the wider system, because our relationships are going to help us to be more resilient. So what I mean by that is having good connections to the local healthcare system. And they may be new connections. They may be, with a local GP in England, with our general practitioners, but in other countries, you might have different systems in terms of who to connect with, so that the people you're serving get well connected. So do you see how the more well connected we are with our social resilience to healthcare, and maybe alcohol and drug services locally, as homeless services, if we're well connected and to see how they are adapting and offering their service into maybe new ways that we're not used to, that's going to be really important. And mental health services, I know that it's very difficult to get mental health services for people with complex trauma histories who are homeless for decades, even before the pandemic. But even so, in England, we've got a public health service, so it's a right to get access to health, both mental health and physical health, which is really important. And so what I'm saying there is, if we think about resilience in a social way, if someone we're supporting is homeless and we help them to get into supported accommodation, our connections and the people in our organization who are connecting to health, to alcohol and drug services, to mental health services, to the physical health services, is going to be really important, because then we can help that person we're serving connect more quickly into those services. And the phrase social distancing as well, it might be better to call that physical distancing, because actually we want people to increase their social connectiveness. So it might be that depending on your resources and your response, but locally you might be buying phones for people who you're supporting who are homeless, so that they can be contacted by maybe the alcohol and drug service and other services. So creative ways to increase people's social network is going to be really important to increase their social resilience, which is this point number 3. And our connectedness to the wider system is going to be really important as professionals working to support people. So that's really important. The 4th tip is to look after ourselves. This is sometimes called self-care in trauma-informed approaches. It can sound really obvious, but it's easy to forget about. I've been helping a homeless team, to have reflective practice sessions online. They're obviously changing the way they deliver their service, but we had our second one yesterday, or one a week ago. And at first there was a lot of emotion expressed about the difficulty, the frustration, the stress. And by expressing it, it helped people to realize how they were feeling, because they could talk and hear other colleagues were also struggling and adjusting. And then that helped people to, this week, people were able to say that they had taken some positive steps that were now looking after themselves better. Some people were walking more regularly and getting out and doing some exercise and eating properly. So there's that ability to notice, instead of just acting out and maybe overworking to help other people. If we don't look after ourselves, we will burn out. So self-care is really important. We need to be physically, mentally, socially, and emotionally healthy. And it's going to be around for a long time. So there's no point burning out and not being helpful to people. If we look after ourselves and pace ourselves, do what we can, but know our limits and boundaries, we're going to be more useful to people. So establishing new healthy habits and routines is really important in order to maintain a caring role. That could be very straightforward things like eating regularly, having breaks, going out, walking. We're allowed once a day to walk in England. It'll be different in other parts of Europe. I appreciate that. But within the public health measures, that's really important to do something that isn't about the coronavirus and to talk about things that aren't that and to do something enjoyable and fun. So that self-care is really important. Tip number 5, the final tip in this series before we kind of open it up to some maybe questions, but just as good as questions are comments about if any of this is connected to your local situation. And so there are 5 trauma-informed principles or values, which I think it's worth me sharing from trauma-informed care. Now, when the whole world turns upside down, as it has done in the pandemic, and people are trying to work out how to serve the most vulnerable in society, because we know that they'll be disproportionately affected in terms of deaths and illness, sadly, through a public health crisis like a pandemic. We don't have loads of off-the-shelf policies. And so what I think is really helpful is to more think about values. And values can help to guide us as we try to do our best on the hoof and talk to our colleagues and our managers and to think, well, is this okay? Is it not okay? And so there's 5 principles which could help to guide that. So people who recover and heal from trauma and services that help them have found that increasing these 5 things helps healing and recovery. So the first thing is safety. I'll speak to a couple of them for a few minutes, but I'll just go through them briefly first. So safety, but safety isn't just about the safety of the people that we're working with. Obviously, we're trying to increase their safety, but it's also about the safety of staff. So that might be about working in safe ways, keeping social distance, depending on what kind of homeless service that you're working in and how it reconfigures in the pandemic. You might be working in a hostel that's for people who have coronavirus who are homeless. So that's a cohort approach might have been taken where people who have the coronavirus are put into one particular building in their own rooms, maybe a hotel. And then you may need personal protective equipment, but it's no good just getting personal protective equipment. You need training in how to use it. But in other situations, you might not need that personal protective equipment. You'd have to look at the public health advice of the health officials in your local area. You might be able to just keep your social distance if it's a cohort where people haven't got the symptoms, but you still need to, you don't know, you need to keep your social distancing and follow the advice of the government agencies and health. So their safety is really important and an obvious one. But empowerment is really important about trying to give people more power. And a lot of people have had their power taken away from them because of the way the world's changed. Increasing people's choice is really important. Increasing collaboration, I'll say something about that in a minute, for a couple of minutes, is really important about how do we work collaboratively with people, and increasing people's trust or our trustworthiness is really important. So if I just speak to a couple of those principles to say, explain why I think the trauma-informed lens or approach and taking some concepts from there is really important, it's emerging practice. So we need some values to guide us as well as some official guidance, and that's changing every day, but the values can stay the same. So we want to keep staff and the people we're serving as safe as possible. And so what we going to want to do there is particularly try to build up good relationships with the people that we're serving in terms of trying to deliver homeless and housing services, because we're going to want to notice if they get the symptoms of coronavirus so that we can follow whatever local policies we decided. It might be that they might move to somewhere that's like for people who are a hostel that's for people who have the virus, or it might be that they stay in place depending on what your local policy is. But also we want that relationship, because we want to notice for those people who start to deteriorate, we want to prompt them to go to hospital. And so that's going to need good liaison and communication with the health professionals locally, and the routes in for anybody into the hospital for those people, because we know that people who are homeless have high levels of those underlying health conditions, so that a large proportion of them are in the vulnerable category. So we're going to need to know the routes into hospital, and also a lot of people who are homeless, as we know, don't care for themselves, and so they won't necessarily be very assertive about going into hospital. Some will be, but some won't be. So they might need our kind of compassion and that relationship and our care to encourage them to say, your cough seems to be getting worse, your breathing's getting worse, and connecting with your local kind of approach to say, I think it's time maybe to connect and try to get you into hospital. So do you see how that safety is about staff safety, the safety of the people we're working with, and it connects then to things like routes into hospital at the right time. It's not for everyone, it's for the people who are getting worse. But also, we want to empower people, because often people will have had a lot of being told what to do in recent days, or encouraged or offered to move off the streets. And people who can be seen as authority figures, even though we're not trying to be authority figures maybe, and people who've got high levels of trauma, it's hard to not get triggered by people being told what to do a lot. So it's worth thinking about that. And one of the examples there to think about, I think, and I'll start to draw my kind of sharing to a close here. If we think about a lot of choice has been taken away from people, but the fourth tip is about working collaboratively. And co-production is another word for that. And that's about sharing power. And this is really important. And this might be a shift for some homeless services, or a challenge, because if you're offering people accommodation, and that's the normal service that you've been offering, maybe a homeless hostel or a shelter normally, sometimes the rules are enforced through a power relationship, intentionally or maybe unintentionally, where there's the threat of eviction. Now, in a pandemic, there isn't the threat of eviction, because we cannot be putting people out into rough sleeping again, where they could become very ill themselves or infect other people. So there's going to need to be much more of a shift into relationship-based, collaborative work, where you're building up trust. And how are you persuading someone to come off the streets and into some accommodations being offered? It's through that relationship of trust, having a caring, compassionate approach. I know that lots of people do this anyway, but it's worth thinking about. There might be a shift now, because we haven't got there isn't the power threat of eviction anymore around accommodation, or there shouldn't be, because the risks of death through the coronavirus outweigh that. So now it needs more of a co-productive, collaborative approach, where we're trying to build up some trust to get people in, and then we're trying to build up some trust maybe for them to stay. And then for some people, a significant proportion of people, we need to build up that trust and work collaboratively, so that when we think that that proportion of people who are starting to become more and more breathless, they seem to be going downhill physically, and they need that persuasion that it's time to phone an ambulance and maybe get someone into the hospital appropriately, that's going to need that trust, because they're going to be quite scared that they think they might be going to die, understandably, and some will. And so that's where a much more of a shift to collaborative working will be important. And I'm not going to go into it now, but I'm going to just, the next kind of short blog I'm going to write is about validation. So there's some stuff about validation that can be really helpful, where you're just acknowledging to someone how they're thinking or feeling. They might say, I don't want to go to the hospital. And so validating the thoughts and feelings someone's expressing can help to calm them down in a tricky situation, maybe because things might get quite difficult in some of the places that people are staying, or as time goes on. And so a collaborative approach is going to be helpful, validating. And in this, it'd be different across Europe. I know that in England, we've got this cohort approach to homelessness here, where we're trying to split people into 3 cohorts. A shielded cohort, or group of people who are vulnerable, who are homeless, who are trying to, and that we call it shielded in England, where you're trying to really protect those people and keep them to self-isolate. But then there's another group of people who have no symptoms, but they don't have underlying health problems. They're homeless. They might have other problems with alcohol and drugs, but they're trying to be put into a separate building, really, hotel, or even a hotel room, a separate room if possible. On the ground, it's very messy and trying to be worked out all the time. But it's a cohort approach around safety, linking it to this trauma-informed approach. And the third cohort is those people who are positive. We can't test people at the moment in England. We're not very good at that at all. But if you're showing the symptoms, you're likely to be positive. The third cohort are people who are being supported, who are homeless or in that vulnerable group, go into a third cohort, which is people who are positive, and we call that COVID care. The shielded group is called COVID Protect, and the no symptoms would be maybe in a traditional homeless hostel. And that's one approach, a public health approach we're trying in England. And so you might be supported in COVID care and get well, or you may end up needing to go to hospital. So I'm linking that to the idea about the principles about safety and how they roll out locally, and how taking a trauma-informed lens or approach could be really helpful. And I tried to put it into a few tips. There's a very good but long 300-page document on trauma-informed approaches, generally I'll put a link to it, by SAMHSA, called Tip 57. It's an American publication, but it's very good. But most people working in a homeless hostel are too busy to read a 300-page document. So I'm trying to sum up some of these in a tip form, and then thinking, well, actually, if we just think about those tips, that we see it through a trauma-informed lens, this pandemic, and it'd be triggering a lot of unresolved trauma, but also it's the reaction to it, that people have diversity and difference in their reactions, and that might help to explain some of my confusion about why are my colleagues reacting differently than me, or why are some of the people we're serving who are homeless reacting differently. Then we also want to think about social resilience. So one of the few people they contact with might be me as a worker, and so I need to have this good connection, new connections with the public health, physical and mental health, with the social issue services and with other services in the area, so that they're more resilient because I'm able to connect, and I'm more resilient because I'm more able to connect with a new world of things. The fourth tip was to self-care and look after ourselves. Easy to forget this, so acknowledge I'm feeling a bit burnt out, frazzled, do some stuff to look after myself and look after others and be looked after. And I'm often not good at that, to be honest, self-care, so I need to practice what I preach, but it's good to flag it up and push ourselves to look after ourselves. And finally, those 4 tips, think about increasing safety, empowerment, choice, collaboration, and trustworthiness, or trustiness. So I think that'd be a good point maybe to draw it to a close and open up to any questions. 30 minutes, I think Robbie was suggesting. So
yeah, you've done very well, Ray.
Was that okay, Robbie?
That was excellent. That was really, really interesting, and I'm sure many of the participants will have lots of questions. So feel free to start putting some questions into the box, and we can get a discussion going with Ray. I actually just off the cuff.
Sorry to interrupt, Robbie. Sorry to interrupt, Robbie. At the moment I just see my my PowerPoint. Is that right? And you're going to ask any questions? I shouldn't be saying anything.
Yeah, I can take off your PowerPoint altogether, if that works, and then everyone can see the two of us.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Perfect. Right there, you can see yourself again. So if anyone has questions, put them into the box. In the meantime, I had a quick question, Ray, on the whole area around social resilience, because when I think of the role of particularly social workers and frontline workers around the social resilience, my initial reaction would have been it's about the human contact, and that people have bad conversations, that they're not totally on their own or isolated. From the way that you were speaking, it was more about how you connect them within a wider network of services and agencies. And do you think there's an important role as well for just the human contact, not physical, of course, but messaging, phone calls, video calls and things like that? Or is it really just about moving people around and knowing what service to refer people to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I'm answering the question, also, just because I might need to do something, because I was just going to try to see you because I can't see you at the moment. So just bear with me 1 second.
No problem.
And I will answer your question. But if you bear with me, make that small, and then make that big. It helped me to answer. Oh, have I disconnected you?
No, we can still see you.
Yeah, maybe I just need to make it big. So I'm going to answer your question. It just helps me, I suppose, the way my brain works is,
to be able to see.
Better. I can see you, then I feel a bit more connected, which answers your question,
of course,
actually.
Which is part of my question.
I've demonstrated it, which is,
Indeed.
I think it's much more important. Well, when I feel anxious, I can end up going into like a process mode where I'm thinking I just more want to process this person needs to go there or there. But actually, it's so important to remember we're human beings dealing with other human beings. And this human connection is so important. And it also links to the work. So it's not in addition or an extra thing, because if I make that connection, so I might have to think really creatively about how the difference of the world that the person I'm working in, because they may not have a phone, they may not be used to any kind of social. I might be coping because I'm Zooming with my family maybe on an evening, but the people we're supporting may have no history of using social media or phones. So anything we can do to make that connection is going to build a relationship, and it's all about the relationship. Is the major message of a kind of trauma-informed approach. And so that relationship is healing in itself, even if I'm just listening to someone, even if it's on the phone, because they can then start to actually, and it's going to make much more likely any work I do to work, because as the trust builds up that this person bothered to even speak to me from a 2-meter distance, and the more we can reach out and connect without breaking the physical distancing rules, it's going to build up trust, and that's going to mean any kind of work I'm trying to do of persuading someone maybe to do something is much more likely for it to work and be helpful if I'm connecting. So I don't know, have I answered your question there?
I think so, yeah. I think the balance between the two is important. Another question from Robin, and this, I guess, both for you, but also for participants if they want to throw some answers into the questions box. But Robin asks this distinction between, we call it social distancing, but what it really is physical distancing between people. And does the words that we use for calling it social distancing, does that kind of, I guess, have a bigger impact on people feeling isolated when what we really want is physical distancing? And so do you think the language we use is important? And also interested to know from other countries, what's the terminology? Is it around social distancing or physical distancing? Because sometimes the words we use have a big impact on how we feel about that.
That's a great question from Robin. Thanks. And it'd be good to see what other people think in the comments. I suppose my thoughts are language is massively important. One of the approaches I really like is called open dialogue. It's an approach from Western Lapland to mental health, a kind of non-medical model way. And that really sees the value of language from a Russian guy called Bakhtin. And so it is incredibly important, because social distancing makes me think in a certain way instead of using the phrase physical distancing. And the public health officials could have started off using the phrase physical distancing, which would have put an idea in people's heads about, oh yeah, and you could then say physical distancing, but social distancing is really important. Social connection is really important because of, remember the third point about resilience and thinking about resilience in a social way. So it's almost like by using the language of social distancing, it implies a kind of social distancing when what they're trying to say is physical distancing. And as people think, oh yeah, we need to distance socially, it weakens the social network, which is the opposite of what we really want. All the science and the data about healing from trauma, coping with trauma, resilience is we want to connect. So in a way, it's a good excuse to promote the importance of creatively connecting with people by kind of challenging that phrase and saying, oh, I think the word physical distance better because of resilience, social resilience. And so language is really important. And I don't know whether there's anyone able to share whether that's an issue in other, we're all having to adjust and make sense of the new measures, aren't we?
Yeah, I'd be really interested for participants to put in the questions box if how they are tackling that terminology. I know in Ireland that for more vulnerable groups and the elderly, they're calling it cocooning. This idea that you're being cocooned and protected, and I think like I guess it's quite a small thing in terms of terminology, but I think it has a different impact that you're not quarantined or you're not in lockdown, because I think the words that we have kind of perpetuate that feeling of entrapment or that distance.
It's so important. So shielding is the word they're using, I think, in England, the one I've heard.
Okay.
So in a way, that kind of provokes in me a positive thought about protecting people, shielding them from something, like. But if you said, like quarantine or something like, it provokes another. So our emotional reaction, I think, as human beings, we're not just rational beings. We're emotional and ethical and relational beings, and so the language we use has an emotional impact. And so cocooning, kind of like that, because they can come out as it could come out as a butterfly then, couldn't it, later on and flourish.
Yeah, exactly. That there's an end point. So we have cocooning, we have shielding. Let us know in the comments if you have other terminology that you're using. Otherwise, some of the questions are more common. It's just people saying that they really enjoyed the webinar, they thought it was really interesting, incredibly relevant for their work right now.
Good.
One point that's really been emphasized is the power balance between clients and professionals around the threat of eviction. And as a person who has experienced this in the past, it's good to know that those relationships are being improved on and built on day by day. I think that's actually really important as well.
Yeah, it could. I mean, what I'd just like to pick up on there, Robbie, is there could be a lot of really positive things come out of this difficult time. Never waste a crisis, because it could be that there's a shift to more relational ways of thinking and trying to, deliberately redress the power imbalances in relationships between professionals and the people we're serving. And so I'm just holding in mind there to be hopeful and positive that although the whole roles that we're in have been shook up and the world we're in has been turned upside down, some of the slowing down and pausing and thinking, well, what's my role? How do I work? And how does it? We could really draw and build up some momentum in the community of people who work with people without a home across Europe and across the world, and in kind of picking up. Actually, we're able to work more relationship based and trust and try to redress the power balance and at least talk about these things. So there could be some really positive consequences coming out of this. At the risk of being overly optimistic, but I am quite a hopeful person, that we could, but we might need to name them as they go along and talk about them to make them stay and have the momentum to say, actually, what have I learned? And we were talking about this in this reflective practice with a service yesterday, doing some reflective practice online to kind of learn from each other. And people are learning lots about the way they work. And so we want to capture some of the learning.
Yeah, I actually have another question here from Claire in Ireland. I think this is something that many participants and services across Europe are struggling with at the moment. So around the whole issue of empowerment, how do you empower a person who is required to self-isolate in a room in a hotel, which is being set up in Waterford in Ireland at the moment, but doubtlessly across Europe as well, being particularly mindful of the history of institutionalization of many of our homeless populations? Many will use substances to cope, and we are now asking them not to leave. And it seems like a minefield and possibly unreasonable to expect the drug-using population to stay in a facility like this. Any suggestions greatly received?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I suppose the way I'd respond to that is, I think at first it can seem really, some of the challenges can seem really overwhelming and difficult. So what's helpful, I think, is to break it down into micro little nudges in the right direction. So one thing that's happening in the homeless services in England is to try and get what's called a distraction packs. Now, this, I didn't particularly like the name of this, but it's basically packs of stuff that can help people to do interesting stuff in their room, which isn't necessarily dependent on technology as well. So it could be, books and all sorts of different things. I don't, it's not, at first I thought always that, but actually you do need stuff to do to break the boredom. So
I mean,
that
I
might
need
sound
that.
like, yeah, we all need that. And so that might sound like a minor response, but I think it's empowering to Claire in Ireland to think there's things I can think of and do to make a difference, rather than thinking this is so difficult a problem or so overwhelming that I'm stuck and I'm powerless. Because that's how a lot of the people we're serving and supporting are feeling powerless. So we can break it down to some micro nudgy stuff about empowering people by seeing whether there's packs for in England there's packs for prisoners I was reading about last night that distraction packs, but there's other things. It's not just for people in prison. But what I'm saying there is people might make up their own distraction packs then about people from charities and volunteers locally. Well, there's also important to encourage people not to put more restrictions on people who are homeless than every other citizen in the world. So in a way, unintentionally, there could be a reaction of the services around to kind of restrict people a bit more than people who have a home. And so it's good to be wary of that. And sometimes it might be answering Claire's question about empowerment. It might be about, sticking up for people and saying, well, actually, like in England, we're allowed one walk a day. So it could be that in anxious times, that unintentionally, the services around people or the local authorities start to say, oh, there's something more anxious about this group of people because they were homeless and now they're in this hotel and we need you to stay there. But actually, you could say, no, hang on a minute. So a bit of advocacy for people. Well, they've got a right to go for a walk the same as everybody else. Well, it might be different in, Italy and Spain and Poland and Ireland. But so I suppose a bit of advocacy there for people's rights, listening to because different things will empower different people. So asking people what would help them, because what I often can overly assume I know what someone wants or would help them. So an empowering thing is to say, this is a really difficult time for you. What would help? And you might have a few up your sleeve suggestions, but which you might chip in and saying, well, do you read novels? That will help a lot. But by asking them what would help, we might be surprised by their answer, but by asking them, we're empowering them. And even if we can't do whatever they say at the time, we might say, well, I'm not sure, I've not heard that before, but I'll go and ask and find out whether that's possible. And then I know some of the policies are changing. There's some controversial areas, about in England, some services for people who are dependent on alcohol, changing their policies to actually buy alcohol for people. I don't know how I feel about that myself, but what I'm saying is, there might be policy changes because you're thinking, well, if you're self-isolating and you depend on alcohol, there's physical risks to just withdrawing from alcohol, and you could die from that if you're dependent on it. So take medical advice, and it might be that the policy changes to actually buy people some alcohol from their money. I'm using it as an example to try to respond to your question from Claire about empowering people. Try to talk to other people about how can we empower this person. Does that answer Claire's question?
I think so. I think there's definitely plenty of takeaway points from that as well. How would you recommend taking trauma-informed approaches through interactions on the telephone? I guess it's more of a physical barrier there. You can't see the person.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting one. So the people I've been chatting to on the front line have found this quite surprising, actually. So at first, the people who tend to work in homeless services tend to like that interaction, human physical contact. So some of the surprises that people have shared with me when I've been helping them to reflect on the work and the emotional wear and tear on the front line is they've been surprised that they've got better relationships going and better interaction with some people they support through telephone contact. And they thought it would be worse. So for some people, and this is where I think being open-minded to diversity and difference is helpful. So for some people, they're finding they're opening up more to their, say, housing support worker over the telephone than they ever did for 12 months of them coming around, sitting down and chatting to them face to face. So there's something freeing and liberating for some people about having that switching to a different mode of communication, which is the telephone communication. Also, know whether you're good. Like, I'm not great on the telephone. The way however my brain processes information, I like to physically see people. You probably saw that when I was a bit anxious trying to see you on the screen, you see, because so I'm not great on the phone. So, and some people are. So know what you like, and then really, this sounds obvious, but the art of listening is so important. Listening, a good listening to, is what some people need. And it's a really healing process. And it's a kind of way to love people, I think, is to listen to them and then to validate what they're saying. So these kind of ideas about validation from sort of counseling skills is to listen to what someone say and maybe repeat back to them what you've heard them say and check, have I heard you right? So you're saying, and they've got an opportunity then in power dynamics to say, actually, no, I was saying that, and they can correct you or they can say, yeah. So if you say, have I heard you right over the telephone, people have the opportunity then, and you could also, rather than in an anxious situation, sometimes I'm keen to get off the phone because I'm feeling anxious. If you notice how I'm feeling as a worker, I can think, hang on a minute, I'm anxious here. I'll resist the temptation to end the call quickly. And I'm really just listening and giving people the opportunity to say, is there anything else you wanted to say? So simple things like that can improve and practice the skills of telephone communication, because often we're not used to that way of communicating. We've been physically pitching up and chatting to people, and we've got all those, visual clues, which I obviously am a bit dependent on. So does that respond a bit to that question about?
Definitely. I have another question. It might touch on something we mentioned earlier, but we have a question from someone who works in a reintegration work environment. But unfortunately, a lot of their daytime activities have been cancelled because they have to protect their clients from the virus. But this person is struggling with activating them, but at the same time keeping them safe from the virus. What is your opinion on daytime activities that can be started that help them with social connection, but at the same time prevent them from being vulnerable to the virus? I guess this comes back a little bit to the social distancing, physical distancing, but also what you mentioned earlier around those distraction packs, like kind of activities that you can do.
Yeah, it does, but it also makes me think about trying to challenge ourselves to think quite radically, and at this point in time. So, and this might involve accessing kind of funds and resources and things like that. But there's lots kind of going on in terms of doing things differently. So practically, it might be not in your typical way of thinking as a service to buy someone a smartphone who's homeless. But now might be the time. But also, it's not just about buying the smartphone. And I'm not saying that's the only one. I'm using it as an example of thinking radically. But it's also, so I've just done this for someone outside of work, but they didn't have a smartphone, so I got them one, but I had to set it up and send it to them, because you've got to not assume that people know how to use this stuff as well.
Yeah.
So there could be a whole kind of useful thing in introducing people to technology through maybe cheap iPads as well. Other things are available. It's not just iPads, but pads. But there's the whole thing about training people how to use it, downloading the apps, not assuming too much, and that could be a whole world. And you could do things like make a little film on your phone with a colleague with social distancing rules or whatever, but make a little film about, this is how I kind of do this, and creatively thinking about getting people active. So I'm not saying online stuff's the only thing, but just because people don't have that knowledge or technology doesn't mean don't try it. It could be, let's radically think about buying people we're serving the technology. And then the other way to challenge our thinking is it's also because sometimes we think I love the way Bakhtin talks about genres and speech genres. So we think all a genre is like a science fiction movie. It's a general way of thinking. And we all have these genres. So we bring these general ways of thinking from before the pandemic into the new world. And they might be quite restrictive. So we're almost socially isolating ourselves within our general ways of thinking about people we're serving. But actually, the pandemic allows us to think outside of that genre. We can suddenly think, what is everybody else doing out there who isn't homeless? And what is the barriers to helping the people we're serving who may be for the first time off the streets, maybe and in a hotel. And so think creatively about what are other people, how are other people solving this problem. So if some people are watching, I don't do this because I'm not very good at exercise, but a lot of people are watching a guy in this country on the internet. Everybody probably knows. He's a PE guy anyway.
Oh yeah,
But
I've seen it.
you probably know.
Joe
Anyway,
Wicks.
so
Yeah.
my wife was trying to get me to join in with this, but I thought it's not really my cup of tea. But for lots of people, so the reason I'm sharing that is what's other people doing to solve it. So it might be about doing some exercise in your room, and then working out what are the fear factors that are blocking people from doing that. So he's doing 20 minutes with that guy whose name I can't remember. Is for some people that might be a way to do a bit of exercise.
Yeah.
And the fear factors that's stopping them is they don't know how to kind of get the YouTube up on a pad. So we buy them a pad, we show them how to do it. And it's not that that's a solution for everyone, but what we're trying to think about is how are other people solving this? What's normal? And how can, and my role as a maybe professional is to creatively push and advocate and get those barriers down to say, well, if it's resources, here's the money for an iPad or a smartphone. If it's to do with knowledge, here's a little film, or I'm talking, in a distance about how to do it. And we're empowering people with creative ways. Does that speak to that question?
No, I think it definitely does. It's a little bit like that Obama quote of never let a good crisis go to waste, like thinking radically outside of the box. Rachel,
yeah, sorry, you go on.
yeah, so Rachel has another question. It's about if you're working with someone who has isolation triggers embodied from memories. So if you're dealing with someone, for example, who's previously been in prison, and so all this like social distancing, it brings back the trauma from that period of their life. Do you have any tips for that type of a situation?
Right. So I think it's a really good point and a really good question. So we feel trauma in the body. It's not just a cognitive thinking thing. We feel it, and so it can be. The phrase would be triggering to be in a similar situation that was very unpleasant, like prison, and this could be like being in prison. So a really good start is by just what's been said is naming and articulating it. Because sometimes people don't know why they're reacting really badly to the situation. But if people can start to connect verbally, appropriately in a conversation, to say, I'm wondering, I'm curious. Because this dialogical approach is a curiosity about what making sense of things is what heals people. So if you think, I'm wondering whether it's connected to a past unpleasant time in prison, and now it feels a bit like being in prison, being in quarantine, that can help because suddenly it doesn't seem like I'm weird. I'm like drinking lots more than I used to do, and I don't know why, and it's not connected to the pandemic, it's not connected. So making connections with people is a healing, therapeutic type in a broader sense of the word, a way to help people. But also the very practical things like grounding techniques. So if people are getting triggered and they're having what's called flashbacks, where it's like a movie, but you get the feeling from like post-traumatic stress disorder type thing. You don't need to call it that, but it's a flashback. Grounding techniques can be very helpful, and that's dead simple. It's just about getting people back to the here and now. And so you might think of like concentrate on your breathing. So you help people to breathe slowly, and then you might say, can you name 3 sounds that you can hear? And then I might hear, I'm very fortunate to have a garden, so I can hear the birds in the tree. And then you could maybe think of 2 colors, or you might physically think of your senses. You could help people think, well, can I feel now? I can feel this seat that I'm on, and I can feel my glasses. So all I'm saying there is grounding techniques they're not complicated. They're not doing anyone any harm. It's not a very, anybody can do them. And it's simply bringing people back, and you can try that with someone, and then they can do it themselves when they're on their own. So when you're feeling triggered and flashback, and I start to kind of feel like I'm back in prison or back in whatever, and then instead of just going for one of those health harming habits to cope, like taking a lot of amphetamine or drinking too much or self-harming, I could try some grounding techniques to think, actually, partly it's understandable because I'm making sense of it now. Oh, this is a bit like being in prison. And therefore it's understandable rather than, I don't know why I'm freaking out. And then the grounding techniques can be bringing you back to the here and now and breathing, appreciating the here and now. And that's a couple of suggestions. I'm hoping that speaks to that question.
Yeah, no, I think it does. There's a point as well coming saying that the Coventry, which is a city in the UK, they're providing, I think they're City of Culture next year, and they're providing packs to people in temporary accommodation to help keep them busy and productive.
Great.
So I guess that's a pretty good example.
The packs.
Another question kind of comes up around the choice that people experiencing homelessness, people without a home have. So if you think of the wider population, you have a choice where you effectively self-isolate. Do you do it in your own home? Do you spend time with family? Do you isolate with friends? Is that something that we should be considering with people experiencing homelessness? I guess there's we're seeing a lot of them, people struggling to self-isolate as they need to socialize, but they can't self-isolate necessarily with friends or family. I guess that comes back a lot to what you mentioned earlier, Ray, around choice, or forcing people being forced into a self-isolating unit in a hotel or some other form of accommodation.
Yeah, and I think it's connected. But what came to my mind listening to that comment or the question was it needs quite a lot of wisdom, I think, sometimes, because there's such a variety of situations people find themselves in who might be without a home. So some of them, it's not, I mean, for some people, rough sleeping, complex trauma history, and very isolated anyway, But there's a whole range there. And there's some people where it could be like, I'm coming out of prison, and do I go and stay with my mum? Or do I go into like a temporary homeless hostel, support accommodation? And I think if I'm in helping someone have that conversation and reflect and think what's the best, it needs quite a lot of wisdom, which is possible to draw on, and to think, because there's a big increase in domestic violence now situations as well, which is also contributing to the homelessness as people flee. But obviously, so that's a big concern. So it's a big pressure on domestic violence services, and there's an obvious link to homelessness services there as well, because obviously people having to leave a situation maybe. So I suppose what I'm linking it in with, on the other hand, for some people, it might be on balance a time when it's okay for that person coming out of prison, the mum's willing to have them back, and it might be a time, I'm supporting someone who's come out of prison outside of work, but they're doing really well in their own support accommodation, and actually they've responded really well to this. So I suppose the thing I'm thinking about is there's such a variety of things. For some people, it might be right to go and stay with a relative. Other people, it might not be. And it's not one size fits all. But having someone to listen and weigh it up and hear what other people think might help it make more likely make a good decision.
Yeah. I think a little bit linked to that point, there's another, I guess it's more of a statement rather than a question, but someone has said that a big struggle that they have at the moment is that people, they're refusing to go to government or social facilities and services because they believe that where they choose to go themselves independently is safer because they're on their own, rather than being in a government space or a social service where you might be around 50 other people. And so that's a big challenge that services are also facing at the moment.
Very much so. And also it brings up the big issue about no recourse to public funds. I know that there's migrants coming from North Africa in, say, the south of Italy, who are having a very rough time of it at the moment. Because the government response is all official, so the kind of any kind of benefits to do with you being an officially registered person. So, in that broad category of no recourse to public funds, that is a big challenge, and that might speak to the area that your question is thinking about. So, what comes in there is that desire to build trust, I think, of those 5 trauma-informed approaches, and actually trying to be realistic about what's on offer, because I don't know what's going to happen. So in this country, because it's a pandemic, the government have changed the rules around no recourse to public funds for people who are coronavirus, there's no tests. So if you have the symptoms, and obviously you need to check with your local health authority about what the rules are. But what I'm saying is, for those people, although the rules might change temporarily, they're worried about, well, but what about after the pandemic? And will it go back
Yes.
to being this? And then will I become to the attention of people? And so I can understand the power relationships really affecting people about, do I engage with the health offer, or do I do what I think? And in Fulfilling Lives, we've supported people with no recourse to public funds in the past, and sometimes they prefer to sleep in a graveyard, for example, than come into maybe things that are very difficult for people because of the rules. But now the rules are changing, it's complicated and it needs a lot of weighing things up. But I think giving people as much information is empowering as possible, and trying to have that dialogue. So listening to the concerns of people and then talking to the authorities about saying these are their concerns, and building that social network of public services and charity services, volunteers around people, so that the systemic approach is better, and it maybe shifts around some of these legitimate anxieties. If I had no recourse to public funds, I'd be anxious about coming to the attention of the authorities. But on the other hand, we don't want people to die. We want people to survive. You can't do anything if you're dead. You've got, the physical survival is essential. We want to prioritize that. But on the other hand, people have psychological needs about feeling safe. And so it's an opportunity maybe to have that dialogue and try to get as much shift from the authorities and reassurance as possible.
There's two last comments, but I think they're both very much linked. And it comes back to this idea of being able to have conversations with people and to try and empower them and understand what it is that they want and need. So Helen has said that she hasn't heard of this happening yet so far, and that while a lot of frontline staff can be doing this and talking to people and asking them what they need, the bigger decisions are coming from a higher level of how funds are being used or how services are being delivered. And so it's very difficult, I guess, to have the client's voice included in how those decisions are being made, which doesn't seem very trauma informed to Helen. It's an overriding top-down issue. And then Michelle, I guess it's on a similar point around the empowerment, has also commented that, in many ways that people feel powerless, but perhaps the question is, to ask the client what would they plan in relation to the structure of their day, and kind of give them the power to say what it is that they want to do in creating their own plan, how they're well, what are their symptoms, and the importance of acknowledging the difficulty and restrictions. So it's not that you say you develop a plan and we can do whatever is in it, but you can say we'll try our best to do what is reasonable, because there's a way to keep hope alive and consider the future when we are out of these extreme restrictions, which I think is also a really, really important point as well.
Definitely, they're great points, and it made me think about what came to my mind listening to those points was, you can think about the big picture, and you can think about the little picture. You can think globally and you can think locally. And so at a local level, we can empower people and we can empower ourselves if we start to feel powerless and I can't do anything. We think, hang on, locally, we do what we can. That's how I kind of cope with this. I think, well, what can I do? I'll do what I can. I'll try and do X, Y, and Z and try to be useful and use my whatever gifts I've got to serve others is a good approach. But at a big level, I'd agree. I think the big, powerful institutions have reverted to top-down and in an anxious way, maybe, but they're not doing a lot of service user involvement, what we call, or collaborative or co-productive work about these. So there's a chance there to listen to what you're finding out on the ground and feeding them back into your local network. So, for example, whatever the local national homeless network organization is, or across Europe, that's the ENSTA, but locally, there's Homeless Link, do a weekly webinar in this country, and there's others, there's St. Martin's in the Field as well. So I'm thinking about these national umbrella homeless organizations. Feed in whatever that is in Italy, Poland, Spain, or Ireland, feed in what you're finding on the ground, and that's a way to try to put the power back, speak the power, speak truth to power, as it were. Listen to what you're finding on the ground about these issues, about no cost for funds, or about people being triggered about being life in prison, or a lack of technology, but feed them back in so that those can take on their responsible role as national organisations to influence the top-down government policies, which may inadvertently be ignoring people who are homeless. Because, you know, in England, we've got a public health service, so it's a right to have health. It's not just like, can you afford it? So I know it varies depending on the politics in each country and the economic structure, but if you feed back what you're finding, it's a way to empower and do a bit of collaborative work. And also think locally, well, what can I do? Do what we can, and then we can feel a bit more positive that we're not powerless. We're involved in trying to help each other and be helped ourselves.
Okay. Well, that's it for all the questions and the comments. Thanks very much, Ray, for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it. And I think the conversation at the end was really interesting. I hope people got a lot out of it. We will be sending, by the end of the week, the recording out. And Ray has sent me on some resources as well that we'll also include in the emails. So there'll be plenty of follow-up materials for everybody. Thanks very much, Ray. And thanks very much, everyone, for joining.
Appreciate it. Take care. Stay safe. Stay true to the path.